afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Venezuela, Crisis, Change, and Consequences, our Spring 2026 series hosted by Columbia University's Institute of Latin American Studies. For those joining us for the first time, my name is Eduardo Moncada. I'm an associate professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia and director of the Institute of Latin American Studies. Last week, our first panel in this series examined the historical roots and current stakes of the U.S.-Venezuela relationship. Today, we turn to what is, for many people, one of the most immediate and lived dimensions of that crisis, which is displacement. Today's panel, Migration and Humanitarian Dimensions, examines the human costs of displacement, responses across the Americas. We're going to be looking at the economics of integration, the evolution of regional policy, what's happening on the ground in transit countries, the pressures on the U.S. immigration system, and what the rapidly changing nature of global institutions means for humanitarian programming across the hemisphere. We have 5 outstanding panelists today: Danny Bahar from the Center for Global Development, Diego Chavez Gonzalez from the Migration Policy Institute, Manuela Orjuela Grimm from Columbia University's Medical Center, Astrid Leiden from the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, and Daniel Najox from Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'll introduce each speaker before the remarks as well. And before we begin, I'll note that our next hybrid webinar on March 12th is when we turn to another critical dimension of the crisis: violence, policing, and the role of armed actors in Venezuela and its neighboring countries. So we hope you can join us for that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And I want to turn first to Danny. Danny is a senior fellow and director of the migration program at the Center for Global Development. He's an associate professor of practice at Brown's Watson Institute and affiliated with the Growth Lab at Harvard. His research focuses on migration, economic development, and the contributions that refugees make to host economies. He's published widely on Venezuelan displacement and served on task forces convened by the Organization of American States on the current crisis as well. Danny, maybe you could help us start with a little bit of an understanding of the scale of what we're dealing with here, the waves of displacement, what the empirical evidence tells us about patterns of integration, and what you think maybe the post-Maduro moment might change in all of this.
Right. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here virtually, hopefully next time in the big city. Things are, as everything, kind of evolving as we go. But let me just start kind of with some numbers. I'm actually working on a project to actually try to understand the whole dimensions of the Venezuelan diaspora, in which occupations they work, in which industries they are. So I think something maybe we can touch upon maybe towards the end, to end on a nice note. It's like how this diaspora will be a huge asset, I think, for the reconstruction of Venezuela. And there are the numbers, using official numbers, we are getting to almost 9 million Venezuelans abroad, 8.7 or so, including about 1 million in the US, 3 million in Colombia, which are the two of the largest destinations, but also big diasporas in Peru, Chile, all over Latin America, some in Europe too. And what we're seeing, this is for the largest displacement of refugees in the modern era. It surpasses, of course, Syria. It surpasses Ukraine. The only big difference is that this is not driven by a war, as in the case of Ukraine and Syria. It's driven by a man-made catastrophe, the implosion of a country that 50 or 60 or 70 years ago was one of the wealthiest countries in the hemisphere. And now it's the source of one of the biggest humanitarian crises and also political crisis and a cruel dictatorship that continues. So this puts it in a bit of a different category. And maybe that's why this crisis, maybe because of the nature of most of the destination countries, which are Latin America, in particular Colombia, we've seen something that is interesting as academics too, which is that the extent to which immigrants are good or bad for society, to use some more regular language, has to do with the policies that are around these waves. There's not such a thing as an immigrant is good or bad. It's just is the policy dealing with these immigrants effective or not. And here we've seen a lot of heterogeneity, but for the most part, I think that the country that I've studied the most and the biggest diaspora, and I think the country that really stands out is Colombia. I'll I'll go back to I'm working on another piece of evidence, which is a survey. It's based on a survey, so this is not causal estimates, but I think it provides some interesting ideas of Venezuelans in Colombia and actually all over Latin America on understanding their labor integration, in particular when it comes to legal status. So I'm talking about Colombia in particular because Colombia put together the largest, I think, in the world program for regularization. At first, in circa 2018-19, started with the PET program that regularized about 500,000 Venezuelans. But then afterwards, towards the end, the middle and the end of the Duque presidency, they actually went with the TPS, which actually targeted about 2 million people in the country. And this was unprecedented. It was extremely generous. And I think there's two questions that I'm going to address. And with that, I'm going to end my remarks. One is like, has this been effective? Can we learn something in terms of policy? And I think that as everything with research, there's a lot of bots and assumptions, etc. But I think for the most part, we're seeing very positive results. In this survey that we're looking at, again, it's not causal, but we see, for instance, that those people who this is across Latin America, not only in Colombia, but those people who say that they have a regular status. Again, this is self-reported. They also claim to have 30%. There's the ones with regular status. They're 30% more likely to have a bank account, which talks about formalization. They're 21% more likely to have a formal job. They're 21% more likely to contribute to Social Security. So this is all about formal markets, which in Latin America is a big thing because informal markets in Colombia, in many countries, are 60-70% of the labor force. So not having somebody only working, but working in the formal sector is a huge win-win, I would say. Then 15% are more likely to feel that their wages there's equity in the wages compared to nationals, and so on. So I think that we have a very good sense that these programs have been positive for the migrants. There is some research I done in more academic settings where we show that also the negative effects have been negligible or non-existent for Colombians. So I think there we have a very interesting, Colombia is a good example of policy in the case of Venezuelans. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is also very important for the reconstruction of Venezuela. The best, if these immigrants are doing better, whatever they are, I think the better it's going to be for the future. Last point, because I think it's very important for the US context, is there is, of course, we cannot separate the migration discussion from the US policy with the rhetoric or facts or whatever you want to feel about it in terms of the flow of Venezuelans to the US over the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, this is definitely one of the determinants of everything that is happening, even though widely exaggerated, I would say, by the administration, but it's there in the picture. And here we also wanted to ask the question: what do migrants say about their willingness to stay where they are in terms of Latin America, based on having a legal status? And here we don't find a very strong correlation. Like just having a legal status doesn't change a lot their willingness to stay where they are. But having a legal status and having a job, or having a legal status and having a contract, that actually does explain some of that difference. So this comes to show something that it's a bit intuitive, but it's still important to put on paper that having the paper, the legal status is not enough. It also really depends on your ability to integrate and to have a good job, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm saying this just to close up in the context that we've been seeing a lot of reversal of these policies, of these generous policies of Colombia by other countries like Ecuador. Ecuador, for instance, I think was seen as the next country that would actually provide this legal status, and for some reason they reverted back. And I think part of the reason is because the politics explains a lot. I'm not a political scientist, like I guess many of you are, but this anti-migration rhetoric has also permeated a lot of the countries in Latin America. A lot of them, I would say also Ecuador, are trying to please the rhetoric in the US. But actually, I think that it's probably generating the opposite effect. Because if the US wants actually to try and have more control about their borders, it is important to motivate the countries in the region to actually pursue legalization and pursue regularization and provide better opportunities for the migrants in the region, because otherwise, actually, that's causing. I mean, if migrants don't have a good quality of life, a good access to labor or other services in those countries, or actually might try to continue their way to other places, including the US. So that's an important point that I just want to put there for discussion, that it's in the interest of the US actually not to have all these countries replicating their anti-immigrant rhetoric, but on the contrary.
Thanks, Danny. That was a great sort of synthetic take on the landscape here. And I hope we get back to some of the key points you raised about, particularly with this notion of sort of the negligible effects for places like Colombia, where the political rhetoric, though, as you rightly point out, sort of has gone in a very different direction. And trying to think about how do we reconcile those will be important moving forward. Thank you. Next, I want to turn to Diego. Diego Chavez Gonzalez is Senior Manager for the Migration Policy Institute's Latin American and Caribbean Initiative. Before MPI, he worked for the United Nations, supporting Colombia's Border Management Office and their response to Venezuelan migration. And he's helped to coordinate displacement tracking across Latin America. And he's worked directly with governments in the region on managing this kind of large-scale displacement. Diego, Danny's given us a bit of the scope. You've been working directly and actively with these governments and shaping some of these responses as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about how these policy responses have evolved, what's working, and what's coming up against some challenges?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Eduardo. And also, let me begin by thanking the Columbia University for convening this very timely, important conversation. It's a privilege to be here. I'm also very honored to share this panel with such distinguished colleagues. Danny, it's always a pleasure. We've had thoughtful conversations over the years about displacement, governance, and regional politics, and I always come away from them a little bit sharper and more reflective. So I'm glad to get to continue that dialogue here today. And I want to frame my remarks around a central question, which is how have regional policy responses to Venezuelan displacement evolved across Latin America, and what should sustained second generation migration governance look like in a context where large scale return remains unlikely in the near term. The recent developments in Venezuela, including the reported capture of Nicolás Maduro, have understandably generated hope and renewed debate about the possibility of return. Images of celebration in Caracas and across the Venezuelan diaspora communities reflected a deep longing political closure, but symbolism does not, I guess, automatically translate into structural change. And when we look at migration through the policy lens, the question is not so much about whether there is political movement, but whether the conditions are emerging that would support durable, large-scale return. And at this moment, the answer remains deeply uncertain. So we are now a decade into what has become, as Danny mentioned, one of the largest displacement crises in the history of the Western Hemisphere, if not the largest. More than 8 million Venezuelans live outside their country. 3 million are in Colombia, over 1.5 million in Peru, 500,000 in Chile, and a little bit more than 500,000 in Brazil, 100,000 in Ecuador. The United States actually hosts about 1.2 million Venezuelans, making it only the third largest destination after Colombia and Peru. And the overwhelming majority remains in South America. And I think this matters a lot because any discussion of return must begin with this reality. The regional system, not just Venezuela, is now structurally interconnected through migration. And the political situation inside Venezuela remains fluid. Under virtually, I think, all possible political trajectories after the capturing of Maduro, whether there is an internal fracture, a prolonged stalemate in externally managed stabilization, or even a negotiated democratic transition, I don't think large-scale return will happen in the near term. And the fracture of the ruling coalition could probably generate more instability and even renewed outward movement. Continued regime cohesion without democratic transition, what it does is just it preserves the economic fragility and weakens the services inside Venezuela. And even under a more favorable scenario, negotiated transition, return would be gradual and selective, dependent on employment, I don't know, service capacity, not just the political change alone. So I think that most of Venezuelans that I've been able to talk to over the last month, month and a half, is that they are all in a what we might call a wait and see mode. And most importantly, what I want to mention is that after nearly a decade abroad, many have established roots in labor markets, in schools, through family formation, through community integration. For some, return remains aspirational. For others, it may be deferred. And for some, it may never occur. And this is the structural, I guess, backdrop against with which we think, or we should think about migration policy in the region. And I want to talk about the second generation, but before I do, let me talk a little bit about the first generation response, the one that, to some extent, Danny mentioned during his presentation, which is the region's initial response. What I would call the first generation was in many ways remarkable. Between 2017 and 2022, Latin American countries adopted large-scale regularization programs. Colombia's TPS, Peru's PTP, Brazil's humanitarian visa framework, Ecuador and Chile's regularization windows. These were pragmatic, flexible, and in many cases, very generous policies. They allowed millions of Venezuelans to obtain documentation, access to labor market, enroll their children in schools, international cooperation, including the US during the first Trump administration, provided a lot of financing that enabled municipal services and integration programs to actually expand in the region. And that first generation of policy was built on solidarity and on rapid regularization campaigns. But it was also designed for a temporary emergency. And we are no longer, I think, living in a temporary emergency. We are living in a protracted displacement context. And this is where I think second generation governance should enter. If large-scale return remains unlikely in the near term, then migration governance must shift from emergency accommodation to sustained stabilization. And I would highlight that there are three core pillars of what second generation governance should look like. The first one is preserving and adapting regularization frameworks. The worst outcome for regional stability would be a sudden erosion of legal status. As political cycles shift and enforcement rhetoric intensifies in the United States and in parts of South America, as also Danny mentioned, there is this temptation to tighten, withdraw, or even condition regularization. But withdrawing status does not produce return, it produces irregularity. Second generation governance means maintaining and adapting regularization tools, even as political conditions evolve. It means recognizing that stabilization is preventive policy, like an insurance company, basically, that invests upfront risk mitigation to avoid much higher costs later. Governments that invest in documentation and labor access reduce long-term stability. And this applies not only to South America, but also in the United States, where the future, for instance, of the temporary protected status and other humanitarian tools that exist carries both national and regional implications. The second part of the pillar, or the second pillar, better yet, is to move from the bilateral pressure that the United States is imposing on several countries to go back a little bit to that regional coordination mechanisms. Migration governance in the hemisphere, what it has taught us over the last decade is that it cannot function through fragmented bilateral arrangements that simply shift the pressure from one country to another. And we have a good platform. We have the Quito process, the South American Conference on Migration, the Regional Migration Conference, the Cartagena Plus 40, CELAC, the MERPS. We have a lot of platforms that can serve as spaces for consensus building across countries. And second generation governance requires coordinated dialogue with the US, yes, but also with Latin American countries, not decisions that are made in isolation out of political urgency or even fear of taxes or the fear of, tariffs or any other type of fear. Migration, I guess, in this region is interdependent. That what has shown through the hemisphere. If integration processes fail in one country, they have an effect on other countries. And the policies that are designed in this sort of like second generation movement should reflect that interdependence. The third is that predictable financing and shared objectives and shared stability objectives are necessary. The first generation of response was made possible in part because there was a lot of financing. We had the concessional financing mechanisms from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. The former USAID was pouring money into the responding of the crisis. But in recent years, and this is not just about this last administration, foreign assistance cuts and uncertainty have disrupted some of the progress achieved in regularization and integration outcomes. The underlying architecture, however, and this is the good news, it remains. We still have a functioning multilateral development banks, instruments that are still there. I mean, they probably don't have as much money as they used to, but they're still there. We still have a window for Latin America at the Global Concession Financing Facility, for instance. The private sector is more involved. The governments now know about regularization and know about integration. They didn't know about this a decade ago. And we also have a very functioning civil society that is stronger than it was at least a decade ago. So stabilization requires predictable investment, not only in border management, but in municipal services, labor market integration, social cohesion, data coordination, institutional infrastructure, because without financing, even very well-designed policy frameworks will ultimately fail. Let me conclude, I guess, by saying that governments and host communities understandably ask, when will people go back? I think for some, it's a legitimate question, but after nearly a decade of displacement, return cannot be assumed as the organizing principle of migration policy in the hemisphere. Even if conditions improve in Venezuela, large-scale return will not be immediate. It will be gradual, selective, and deeply influenced by migration intentionality. For many Venezuelans, and this is part of like the work that I'm doing right now, the journey abroad has become part of a longer life trajectory, one that includes integration, circular movement, and transnational ties. Second generation governance means planning for that reality, not because return is impossible, but I guess because stabilization requires a sense of realism as well. So the capture of Maduro reopened Venezuela's political question, but it did not resolve the migration question. Regional policy responses have evolved from emergency solidarity to structured regularization and integration, but the next phase must be one that is sustained in, I guess, governance, grounded in regularization, coordination, and predictable financing. And if we approach migration as the stabilizing force to be suppressed, fragmentation will follow. But if we approach it as a structural feature of our interconnected hemisphere, one that can be governed through cooperation and a sense of realism, it can become a very strong stabilizing tool or instrument for the region. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Diego. That was great, and you gave us lots to think about there. Particularly this point about sort of the need for a regional response versus a fragmented response. And one of the things I'll hope we can come back to is trying to think about in a bit based on what Danny was saying as well. Sort of given the current sort of geopolitical moment and the sort of polarization and countries sort of aligning with the United States versus not aligning with it, it'd be interesting to think about how that might impact the prospects for this sort of regional response that you're underscoring as highly important. I'm going to turn to our next speaker, Astrid Leiden. Astrid is a Rhodes Scholar with a Master's in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies and a Master of Public Policy from Oxford, and a Columbia alumna. She's worked with the UN Refugee Agency in Colombia, Servicio Jesuito a Migrantes in Chile, and the Welcome Corps. And she's currently based in El Paso, where she works for the Hope Border Institute, a Catholic strategy center responding to migration and mass deportations. Astrid, a lot of the people, the families that we've been talking about end up where you are at the border and in the U.S. system. If you could kind of bring us into that and tell us a bit about what Venezuelans are facing there, who's stepping in when these migration policy shifts are happening, we'd appreciate it.
I think you should be able to hear me now. Yes, thank you so much, Eduardo and ILAS, and my co-panelists. It's a really big honor to be back. And like Eduardo said, right now I am based in El Paso, Texas. Before I kind of go into the overview of what I'll be discussing, I think it's really relevant given what Dani and Diego and Manuela mentioned, the fact that the implications of the displacement of Venezuelans, and in particular in the United States, we need to look within the US, but I think that the perspective I'll give is also a little bit cross-border, kind of what's been spoken of earlier. The implications of the ending of status here in the US has effects oftentimes on partners in Mexico and Latin America who are responding. So hopefully I'll be able to give a bit of an overview there. I'll start first just by exploring and explaining who are the Venezuelans in the United States. We got a little bit of kind of numbers from Diego earlier, but there are about 1 million Venezuelans that are within the United States. And I think it's important to look when we speak about Venezuelans in the US by date of arrival. Why do I bring up date of arrival? A lot of the statuses that I'll be mentioning are focused on specific years, oftentimes because we saw reflections of high arrivals at certain times and in response to the United States implemented temporary protections or some or other type of humanitarian protection in order to respond to the big amounts of Venezuelans that were arriving, not only through the southern border. There were a lot that came through the southern border, and I'll speak a little bit about El Paso and the detention center that we have later on. But it's also important to know that not all of the Venezuelans who were protected under temporary protected status are recent arrivals. As you can see here, about 80% of Venezuelans came 2010 or later. But looking earlier than that, it's almost evenly split before 2000, which we can oftentimes see people who arrived before the rise of Chavez or at the initial kind of beginning of his power. And then 2000 to 2009, another 10%. So in total, it's important to see that understanding going into the protections that exist for Venezuelans when we see those timelines. So there are many protections that Venezuelans receive, not just protections that have to do with Venezuelans specifically, or those that are targeted towards Venezuelans. And I think it's important to note, Diego kind of touched on this, on how many Latin American countries were very novel in their response to expanding legal statuses, because the sheer amount of Venezuelans that had arrived was something that they had never seen before. In the United States, as a country of migrants, and as well as a country that has received populations before Venezuelans, a lot of these statuses already existed. They were just expanded to Venezuelans when the time came. The most prominent one, which I'll speak a little bit more at length about in a bit, is the temporary protected status, which is a status that exists for many countries. It's not just for Venezuela, but it was expanded as a form of protection, and initially, a version of work permit and protection against deportation for Venezuelans given the country conditions. And important to note the sheer numbers, many Venezuelans, the majority of those are in the United States, had received the status. So about 600,000 Venezuelans, with the majority in Florida, of course, and in Texas. And important to note that temporary protected status, as being a blanket kind of status that many people were able to apply to depending on their date of entry, also meant that there were Venezuelans who had multiple statuses, which meant that someone could have applied for asylum, but they received temporary protection because it oftentimes came first. Humanitarian parole, which I won't speak about too much at length, covered over 100,000 Venezuelans. Venezuelans was the second population behind Haitians who received this, which is also a temporary form of entrance into the United States with a sponsor. And then finally, asylum, which follows the traditional asylum pathways that we have here in the United States, just the amount of Venezuelans that were applying for asylum, in particular, those who had applied for double statuses, to put it that way, those who had applied for asylum and also applied for temporary protection when it came out. So why do we speak about temporary protected status? In particular, because it is probably the most notable status that Venezuelans have received, just because of the sheer number of individuals who were covered by it. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just Venezuelans who receive it, but Venezuelans are the top receivers of temporary protected status. The next population that comes is about 300,000. So Venezuelans, Haitians, Somalia, Yemen, many countries have been under this based on their country conditions. So it meant that the Department of Homeland Security, at the time when there was a crisis going on in the country, or at the time when there was a large population that is irregular within the country, determines that the country conditions reach a point to which the country can be designated a temporary protected status country. And this protection essentially prevented deportation and detention, and it provided employment authorization as well as travel authorization. And it's important to note here as of March 2025, because that is a key date as we're seeing the beginning of the second Trump administration. So before going into TPS, there are some other kind of ends of legal statuses that we've seen in the US for Venezuelans that I think are really, really important to note. The first was the partial travel ban. As we saw, Venezuela was on the list, not of the complete travel ban, but as above the partial travel ban that received some restriction on entry as well as processing of visas and permissions in the United States. The CBP-1 application, which had been a form of legal entry under the Biden administration, which essentially allowed for those migrants that I think Manuela was referring to, many of those who were in Mexico and those who wanted to present themselves at a port of entry to seek asylum, to seek some sort of entry, those application interviews were canceled. So any Venezuelan or any national who had tried to apply and enter the United States with their appointment on or after January 20th, 2025 was essentially left stranded in Mexico, and as was mentioned earlier, left at the generosity, the response was the generosity of the Mexican, in particular, non-governmental organizations. And then finally, humanitarian parole, which was the other status I referred to earlier, because of the travel ban that was placed on certain nations, in particular, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, which were 3 of the 4 countries, excluding Nicaragua, that received parole, those cases are being re-examined. So it's important to note that, you know, the termination of status, I think it's really important to discuss the nuances, which are the statuses that are being impacted. But a lot of this has begun as of January 20th of last year. So of course, civil society, and I think this is part of what Eduardo asked me to mention as well, kind of the responses on how are people pushing back on this. There is currently a case that is being put through the courts. It is spearheaded by the National TPS Alliance, which is an organization that was really funded before, it was founded before Venezuelans were TPS receivers. I think from what I understand, it started from Nicaragua. But a lot of other organizations have gotten into this lawsuit against Noam, Christy Noam, who is the head of the Department of Homeland Security. And the court has, you know, begun to hear arguments and has begun to respond. Essentially, the case is saying that temporary protected status, when it was terminated, as you can see here on February 5th of 2025, right, soon after the Trump administration took power for a second term, the justification for the end of temporary protected status was that the country conditions had improved. And I think as we've talked about earlier, and you know, as all of my co-panelists here can say, we know that that is not true. So that has given justification for this case to go forth within the courts, and I won't go into the deep kind of different timelines of it, but the case made it all the way. It was in the Ninth Circuit in California. There was a decision as well by the Supreme Court that essentially said that as of right now, the late January 2026 decision, the Court of Appeals said that the Trump administration unlawfully ended temporary protected status, as it is attempting to do with other countries and as it attempted to do in its first administration, most notably with many Central American nations. However, because the Supreme Court had made a decision on it, it does not restore it. So what does that mean? There were about 600,000 Venezuelans, as I mentioned earlier, that had temporary protected status. Important to note that there were some within that category that have other statuses that oftentimes trump the end of temporary protected status, asylum claims being one of them. There has also been a declaratory judgment with this decision from California that essentially protects individuals who are being detained. So it can help individuals get out of detention, in particular if they were Venezuelan and have been part of this lawsuit. So who remains protected? I think it's important to note the end of TPS. There is a population that does remain protected, and it's those who received their employment authorization before February 5th of 2025 that have an expiration date of October of this year, right? So it's important to know that there is some protection, but it is a pretty serious ending of a status just because the sheer amount of people that it did impact. So I think it's also, I'll speak a little bit quickly to wrap up about the moment that we're in now, right? So the end of TPS, you have a population that is protected, you have a population that still has pending claims, But the reality of the moment that we're in now with the Trump administration's intentions of mass deportation campaigns really does worry us, right? I'm based in El Paso, as I mentioned, largest detention center. We have seen Venezuelans that have come across in the past few years, and we also seen Venezuelans that are detained. And so I think it's important to note that, you know, certain statuses for Venezuelans have really caused this to be more complicated. There was an expedited removal memo that essentially put into jeopardy those that had parole. And mentioning third country removals is also very important. I think mentioning what Diego said about the binational agreements between countries is that many countries are getting into agreements with the United States in order to receive individuals, oftentimes because of the threats of tariffs. And we have, you know, cases documented of Mexican organizations that have received Venezuelans that have been deported from the United States, but also really important to note Venezuelan national politics at this moment. For the past few years, the Maduro regime has actually been, they say, receiving widely and receiving well, you know, warmly Venezuelans who have been returned under Plan Vuelta a la Patria. We know that this is very much a show for the regime, but kind of making the narrative to be that Venezuelans persecuted abroad for seeking protection, they're going to be welcomed home with open arms. And we've seen this kind of narrative keep playing out, and also being mentioned in the National Assembly that these individuals will not be protected under the recent amnesty law that was put forth. And to wrap up, I think it's important to know, you know, what are the organizations doing in response, right? So this is coming from a forthcoming report that we have with the Hope Order Institute, Jesuit Refugee Services in Mexico, some of the other partners, actually, Manuela, that we've worked with, that are saying that, you know, in the past, Venezuelans were, you know, in the past and now what we're seeing is that Venezuelans are amongst a lot of other nationalities that are being sent to Mexico, returned to Mexico. But what is more worrisome for us, especially, is that under the Biden administration, individuals who were deported or threatened to be deported, at least were done so, and were given what's called a credible fear interview sheet. That means that, you know, if I'm deported, if I'm detained, and I have a status that has been revoked, I can say, because of my country, I have a credible fear of returning, and I should be given an interview. That is how the law works. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is people being deported and sent to Mexico who aren't receiving that paper, which means that they're being denied their credible fear interview. So that, you know, access to due process is really concerning for us. So briefly, to just conclude, the 4 ways that I think it's important to say how civil society is responding and how we've responded in El Paso. We're preparing people, right? So Venezuelans who have remained without the status, preparing for family preparedness plans, what to do with your children, what to do if families are separated, and accessing a lawyer in advance. Documenting, so making sure that we're having these stories. Hope Order Institute with our partners in Mexico has been really doing this work to make sure that we're documenting, you know, the statistics that we don't have, and the statistics of deported Venezuelans that we actually don't have because they're not reported by Department of Homeland Security, and oftentimes people don't know their family members are deported or detained for days or weeks until they get a phone call from back home. Accompanying, so we're, you know, making sure that individuals who are going to court visits, individuals who are still in legal proceedings, are not doing so by themselves. And then finally, informing, right? And I think to say know your rights in the context that we're in is very complicated, because we know that know your rights only gets us so far based on a lot of internal procedures that have been updated in the past few weeks. But given the case of what's gone on in Venezuela over the past few weeks, really important, a lot of organizations are encouraging individuals to update their pending asylum claims. So, you know, if you're still receiving threats from Venezuela, if you are the new laws that have been passed in Venezuela, the continuance of many laws of persecution in Venezuela, making sure individuals are updating those cases to reflect the reality of what's going on. Because, you know, as much as there is a lot of culture of fear, it's also important to be prepared to know what the next steps are as these policies keep going through the courts. So I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Astrid. Thanks for bringing in civil society as this key actor as part of this process. Certainly something that we needed to underscore and think about more. I'm going to turn quickly to Daniel. Daniel Najux is faculty director of the UN Partnership Initiative at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and coordinator of the Columbia Committee on Forced Migration. He's published widely on migration, refugees, development, and global governance, and he regularly advises UN agencies and governments on displacement and humanitarian policy. So Daniel, thank you for being here. And maybe you can help us understand a bit about the sort of multilateral machinery here behind all of this, and how some of those changes in that machinery are impacting some of the programming that we're seeing across the region.
Absolutely. Thank you, Darren, everybody who's dialing in. And again, we have seen the last two presentations took us like the route to north, right? And now we were in the US and taking us back to the region, where the majority of the Venezuelan displacement is hosted, as we heard, like from the 8 million, I think 6 or so million are in the region. The UN, and for those of you who don't know that, right, the UN has, since 2015, with the first, when the Syrian crisis really happened, started experimenting with regional plans. So in the Syrian crisis, in 2015, we created, and was part of the group that was advising that, the 3RP, the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan for the Syrian crisis, which was not in Syria, but in the neighboring countries. And then 2019, a similar plan and platform was created for Venezuelan crisis, right? So since 2019, there has been the interagency platform for refugees and migrants from Venezuela, which has these regional refugee and migrant response plans. It's a very technocratic idea, but the current plans have more than 200 agencies. So it's many UN agencies, so it's co-directed by IOM and UNHCR. But UNDP, UNFPA, the World Food Program, and many other UN entities, but also many NGOs are part of these plans. So, and this is really at the regional level where there is planning. It's similar to humanitarian clusters where they're working on shelter, on health, on livelihoods, on anti-trafficking, on food, on WASH, which is water and sanitation, education. So a lot of the important sectors of development and humanitarian action are covered by these regional plans. And then, of course, there are national plans that break down these things. And again, today we don't only have a lot of anti-migrant and refugee rhetoric, we also have a lot of anti-UN rhetoric, right? Like spearheaded by the Trump administration. And I'm all for criticizing the UN for not being sufficiently efficient, right? That we can have those discussions. But what people don't understand is that the UN is actually doing quite a bit. And there are kind of impacts actually for those populations, and never by themselves, but the UN actually supports national governments and subnational governments in Colombia, in Peru, in Brazil, in Chile. And the regional plan actually covers 17 countries. So even Trinidad and Tobago and some other smaller countries which have still some Venezuelans, but they're not as prominent as Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Brazil, for example. Under the last plan, about 17.7 thousand activities, right? So a lot of activities. And the question, of course, what the impact is, but overall, there have been a lot of work on Venezuelans, on their needs, etc. But one important thing is that those plans always have a funding deficit. So the largest amount of all these plans since 2019 that have been funded was the first plan, which was funded at a 55% rate. So what they said that the needs assessment, and 55% was since then it has been dropping. The last couple of years, about 35, 40%. And obviously in the current funding scenario where the US is cutting most of its development funding, especially when it comes to anything migrant related. And then Venezuela is a crisis they want to handle in a different way, like sending submarines and stuff like that, right? So because so the UN, the US had financed 2025 last year, 383 million for this regional plan, and that plummeted last year to 44 million, right? So a huge decrease, which means the current plan or the last year's plan was funded about 15%. If you look at what UNHCR is getting, UNHCR's appeal for the entire Americas is currently funded at 18%. And so often we ask ourselves, okay, what is the limitation? What people say the UN is breaking down, IOM is getting less money, UNHCR is getting less money. And what we see, of course, is like some staff members are being let go, like they have to shrink their operations. But it really just means there are a lot of people who would get shelter, people who that anti-human trafficking programs. There are people who food. WFP had to have their contributions last year. And if you look at the needs assessment, they're very clear that there are many people in dire need of food assistance, of medical assistance, education assistance, etc. In spite of Colombia and other countries being very good hosts. This is just a question about how many more people will die or live in dire circumstances because we can't afford the relatively low numbers. Because again, like if we look at your personal bank account, 100 million, 200 million sounds like a lot of money. Like for me personally, it would be a lot of money. But in the larger scheme of things, for governments, for development assistance, that's nothing, right? So we could actually reach a lot of people, especially because we have like most of the host governments for the largest stocks of Venezuelan migrants are kind of receptive. They're not hostile per se. So then you can leave 67% of Venezuelans in the region do have some kind of legal status, right? So you can actually, that's a good scenario for having livelihood programs. Two things, and then I'm leaving up for a question because I know we're nearing the end of our time. We also see the Darien Gap, right? The Darien Gap that Manuela mentioned was one of the key ways of valve where people went through. And we had a big ILAS event like 2 years ago here on this, and it was always very problematic, very dangerous, very like a lot of trafficking, a lot of abuse happening there. But last year, the numbers of people trafficking or migrating through the Darien Gap decreased by 98%. 98%, right? It's almost stopped. Last year, with 2,800 people. That's like nothing. So that also one has to understand that people are going back because the border to the US is kind of closed and Mexico is reacting in a certain way, and that has repercussions. The Americas and Latin America have been for a long time at the forefront of very innovative processes. With the Quito process, the Cartagena Declaration on refugees, right? There have been a lot of better processes than in Europe and other parts. This year we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, and actually we at the Committee on Forced Migration in Colombia, we're in the process of mounting a long program. So there's lots of things we need to think about how in the current climate, how can we actually uphold those core norms about refugee protection? But we often talk about how Venezuelans and migrants and refugees, and just a side note here, right? Venezuelans have a very special status. Even the UN calls them refugees and migrants from Venezuela. UNHCR puts them into their overarching 42 million refugee category, but they're very special. They don't fall under actual refugees. For good reasons, because some of them are actual refugees, persecuted, some just flee because there's very bad economic policies, right? They have a very special status under international law, which is not really clear whether they're actually refugees, bona fide refugees or not. But the IOM has released in December last year a study that shows that regionally, migrants and refugees from Venezuela contribute, I'm stressing, contribute about 10.4 billion, with a B, billion US dollars every year to the regional economies, right? So I think an important reminder, which I want to like finish on, is that even though we focus on the vulnerabilities and how to address them, they're not only victims, they're not only people in need, but also they create business, they consume, they pay taxes. And I think that is one important thing to consider, that the migrant story is not just about protection and upholding rights, but it's also about understanding that these people contribute and their assets to the communities where they live.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for giving us that big panorama of what's been happening here. I know we are up against time, and I know that several of you do have to go. If there's anything we've learned today, it's certainly about the complexity, but all the different moving parts that all of this has, right? From starting in Venezuela itself and the politics happening there, to the dynamics of the flows of people coming north that Manuela and Astrid brought us to the sort of broader machinery in the region and in the globe that Diego and Daniel just kind of talked about too. I do want to end on that particular note that Daniel actually underscored, which I think is a great note to end. Oftentimes these conversations can sort of leave us in a very dark place when we finish them. But I think the point that you're raising here about sort of the economic contributions that these populations are making, the livelihoods that they're building in these different places along the way and in the United States and in other places, I think represents a great deal of hope. And it represents a great deal of hope, perhaps, for something that Danny, who had to step away, did mention as one of the nice things or the nice notes that we should end on, which is the possibility that the diaspora could also represent a significant boom for Venezuela Obviously, Diego mentioned that the challenges for that are multiple and significant. And Astrid sort of highlighted some of the dangers of what's been happening here on the U.S.-Mexico border. But I think ending on that note as one that maybe can give us a bit of hope for the future, obviously assuming that the politics can align and sort of facilitate some of that return, is a good one to end with. So I want to thank everyone here for spending a bit of time today to share your insights and share your experiences with us. Thank everyone online as well for doing so. And I hope that we are able to once again see each other again, perhaps in person next time for this type of conversation that merits much more than an hour as well. So thank you again.